The billionaire's sons were deaf, until the new housekeeper did the impossible. Richard Thompson was sitting at his desk on the top floor of the tallest commercial building in New York City, but his thoughts were far from the business that had made him one of the richest men in the country. For 7 years since the birth of his twins Michael and Matthew, his life had become a roller coaster of dashed hopes and doctors repeating the same discouraging words. At that very moment, in their Beverly Hills mansion, the two blonde-haired boys were playing in complete silence in the indoor garden, unaware of the noise of the world around them. She was the third housekeeper in 6 months. The previous ones had quit, claiming they couldn't stand the heavy atmosphere of the house where no one spoke loudly and everyone walked on tiptoe as if they were at a perpetual funeral. Sarah Johnson, 34, watched the boys through the living room window as she dusted the mahogany furniture. Unlike the other employees, she didn't feel sorry for them. There was something in their eyes that intrigued her, a liveliness that contrasted with the melancholy that dominated all the other residents of the house. When she tapped the duster against the glass coffee table, she noticed that one of the boys, Michael, turned his head slightly toward the sound. "Mrs. Thompson," she called to the housekeeper who was passing through the hallway carrying clean clothes. "Do you know these children well?" "I've known them since they were born, my dear. Poor things, they live in this world of silence. Mr. Richard has spent a fortune on specialists from all over the United States. Even doctors from abroad came here, nothing. The boys were born this way and they'll stay this way." Sarah nodded, but something inside her refused to accept that resignation. When she was a child, her neighbor in Greenwich Village had a son with similar problems, and she remembered how the boy reacted when they played loud music on the radio, bringing his ear close to the device. During the lunch break, while the boys ate silently in the breakfast nook with the nanny, Sarah took the opportunity to talk with Mrs. Williams, the cook who had worked in the house for more than 15 years. "Mrs. Williams, can you clear something up for me? Have the boys always been like this, completely deaf?" The 58-year-old woman stopped chopping vegetables and sighed deeply. "Well, Sarah, when they were babies, we sometimes had the impression that they could hear something. Mrs. Elizabeth, their mother, even mentioned to me that she thought it was strange, because when she sang softly by the crib, they would calm down, but the doctors said it was our imagination." "And where is Mrs. Elizabeth now?" "Traveling, as always. After the doctors said there was no hope, she couldn't bear to be near the children anymore. She's always off to Europe, anywhere far from here. Mr. Richard pretends he doesn't care, but we can see he suffers a lot." That information stirred something in Sarah that she couldn't explain. After lunch, while reorganizing the books in the library, her hands trembled when she found a series of volumes about hearing impairment. The pages were yellowed and marked with desperate notes in Richard's handwriting. Comments like "tried this, didn't work," and "doctor said it's a waste of time" filled the margins. Later, when she went to clean the boys' room, Sarah did something that could cost her her job. She took a small toy drum that was stored in the corner of the closet and began to tap it gently. Michael and Matthew, who were playing with building blocks on the floor, stopped what they were doing. Michael was the first to approach. He touched the drum with his hands and smiled when he felt the vibration. Matthew followed him, and soon both had their palms pressed against the instrument, laughing as Sarah played different rhythms. "What's going on here?" Richard Thompson's deep voice cut through the magical moment like a blade. Sarah turned around, startled, finding the tall man in a dark suit standing at the bedroom door with an expression mixing anger and confusion. "Dr. Richard, I was just what? Giving false hope to my children. Do you think we haven't tried music before? Do you think we're idiots?" The boys sensed the tension in the room and moved away, returning to their building blocks as if nothing had happened. Sarah felt her heart racing but kept her voice steady. "Doctor, with all due respect, I don't think they're completely deaf. Don't give me that talk. Dozens of doctors, very expensive tests, treatments abroad. Do you think you know more than specialists trained at the best universities in the world? No, sir, but no buts. Finish your work and stick to what you were hired to do. Clean the house. Don't play doctor with my children." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. That night, Sarah could barely sleep in her small apartment in Queens. She kept thinking about the boys' reaction to the drum, the way they had smiled and approached. It wasn't her imagination. There was something there that everyone was ignoring. The next morning, she arrived at work determined to be more discreet, but not to give up. While cleaning the living room, she noticed that whenever she passed the vacuum cleaner, one of the boys looked in the direction of the appliance. It wasn't a normal hearing reaction, but it was something. Richard had left early for a business meeting, and Elizabeth was still on one of her extended trips to Europe. The house was under the care of Mrs. Thompson, who had a much more flexible temperament than the boss. "Mrs. Thompson, may I ask you a question about the boys?" "Of course, dear, what is it?" "Have you ever noticed if they react to any specific type of sound?" The housekeeper stopped folding clothes and became thoughtful. "You know, yes. When there's a storm and it thunders very loudly, they get more agitated. And when Dr. Richard plays that classical music very loudly on the living room sound system, sometimes I see them stop what they're doing." "And do the doctors know about this?" "I mentioned it once to Dr. Richard, but he said they were just reactions to air movement or vibrations in the floor, that it didn't mean they could actually hear." Sarah felt she was on the right track. During lunch, she asked permission to use the house computer and spent an hour researching different types of hearing loss. She discovered there were cases where people couldn't hear normal sounds, but could perceive very low frequencies or vibrations through their bones. When the boys woke from their afternoon nap, Sarah was in the living room, organizing some objects she had set aside. An old music box she found in the attic, a small bell, different types of materials that produced various sounds. Michael and Matthew came running down the stairs, as they did every day. Sarah waited for them to settle on the rug to play, and then opened the music box. The delicate melody began to play, but she noticed it wasn't the sound that caught the boys' attention. It was the vibration of the box against the wooden floor. Carefully, she placed the box directly on the wooden floor and increased the contact. The vibration intensified, and for the first time in 7 years, both boys ran toward a sound, not to hear but to feel. Matthew arrived first and put both hands on the box, then his face, then lay down on the floor beside it. Michael immediately imitated him. Both stayed there, smiling, feeling the music through their entire bodies. Sarah could hardly believe what she was seeing. Tears began streaming down her face as she watched those two children who had been condemned to silence discovering a new way to experience sounds. "My goodness, what is happening here?" Mrs. Thompson had arrived without making a sound and was standing at the entrance to the room, her eyes wide open. Sarah prepared herself for another scolding, but to her surprise, the housekeeper approached and knelt beside the boys. "Are they feeling the music?" "Yes, Mrs. Thompson, through vibrations. I think they can perceive sounds this way." "Is that possible?" "There are special devices that transmit sound through the bones of the skull. I saw it online. Some types of deafness can be bypassed this way." Mrs. Thompson fell silent for a moment, watching Michael and Matthew completely absorbed in the experience with the music box. "Dr. Richard must not know about this yet. He'll be furious and send you away before even understanding what's happening." "So you think it's worth trying?" "My dear, I've taken care of these boys since they were born. If there's a chance, even a small one, to help them, we must try, but very carefully." The two women made a silent pact at that moment. During the next few weeks, whenever Richard was working and Elizabeth continued traveling, they began small experiments with the boys. Sarah brought from home some simple musical instruments she had bought at a department store. A small xylophone, some rattles, a triangle. They discovered that the lower the sounds were, the better the boys could perceive them through vibrations. Matthew showed more sensitivity to metal instruments, while Michael reacted better to wooden sounds. It was as if each had their own preferred frequencies, their own way of hearing the world. Mrs. Williams also joined the small secret group. During playtime in the kitchen, she would bang wooden spoons on pots of different sizes and observe the boys' reactions. They had developed their own system. When they liked the sound, they clapped their hands. When they didn't like it, they shook their heads. It was almost as if they were learning a new language, a form of communication no one had imagined possible. The first big test came 3 weeks later. During a business dinner Richard organized at the house, there were 15 important guests, business people and investors he needed to impress. Elizabeth had returned from one of her trips specifically for this occasion, elegant as always, but with that distant air of someone who could no longer emotionally connect with her own family. The boys were supposed to have dinner earlier and stay in their rooms during the party, as always happened. Richard didn't like guests seeing the children, not out of shame, but because he couldn't stand the pitying looks and uncomfortable questions. Sarah was in the kitchen helping with final preparations when she heard Elizabeth talking with a friend in the living room. "It's terrible, Catherine. Sometimes I look at them and can't help thinking about what could have been different. The doctors said it might be genetic, it might be something that happened during pregnancy. I blame myself every day." "But Elizabeth, you've already done everything you could. You took them to the best specialists, spent fortunes on treatments, and nothing worked. Richard says we have to accept it. But how can you accept seeing your children trapped in a world of silence forever?" Sarah felt her heart tighten. That mother was suffering as much as her children, but didn't know there might be a way out. During dinner, while serving the guests, she noticed the conversation was turning to social projects and charity. One of the investors had mentioned a foundation he maintained for children with disabilities. "It's impressive how medicine has evolved, Richard. Nowadays there are treatments that were unthinkable just a few years ago." "Unfortunately, not always, William. My children are proof of that. We've tried everything." "Are you familiar with Dr. Jennifer Roberts' work? She specializes in alternative auditory perception. She works with cases considered impossible." Richard became visibly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "We've consulted more doctors than I can count. I don't want to get my hopes up again." Sarah nearly dropped the tray she was carrying when she heard Dr. Jennifer's name. She was exactly the specialist she had read about online, one of the pioneers in bone conduction techniques in the United States. After all the guests had left and the family had retired for the night, Sarah stayed up late researching everything about Dr. Jennifer Roberts. She discovered that she had developed innovative methods for cases of partial deafness and that her clinic was right in New York City in the Chelsea neighborhood. The next morning, she made a decision that could change her life. She took her savings and went to Dr. Jennifer's clinic. She knew she didn't have money for a private consultation, but she needed to at least try to speak with someone on the staff. The receptionist was polite but clear. Without health insurance or private payment, there was no way to schedule an appointment. Sarah was about to give up when a gray-haired lady approached her in the waiting room. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help but notice you seem distressed. Can I help you with something?" "I work as a housekeeper for a wealthy family. Their sons are deaf, but I think they can perceive some sounds through vibrations. I wanted to speak with Dr. Jennifer about this, but I can't afford a consultation." The lady smiled kindly. "I am Dr. Jennifer Roberts." Sarah was speechless. The doctor took her to her office and listened attentively to everything she had to say about Michael and Matthew. She asked several specific questions about the boys' reactions and asked Sarah to describe in detail the experiments they had done. "What you're describing is very promising, Sarah. There are different types of hearing loss and some can be partially overcome with the right techniques, but I would need to examine the children to be sure. The problem is their father doesn't want to hear about doctors anymore. He's lost all faith. I understand completely. It's a natural reaction after so many frustrations. But if you'd like, I can give you some guidance on simple exercises you can do at home. It won't replace professional treatment, but it could help develop the perception they've already shown they have." Doctor Jennifer spent over an hour explaining basic techniques for vibrational stimulation and bone perception. She gave Sarah some printed materials and even a small vibration device that could be used in the experiments. "One important thing, if you continue to see progress, there will come a time when you can't hide it from the children's father anymore. And when that happens, he needs to be prepared to accept that perhaps the previous doctors didn't explore all the possibilities." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video and especially to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Back at the mansion, Sarah shared Dr. Jennifer's guidance with Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Williams. The three of them organized themselves to implement the exercises systematically, always taking advantage of the times when Richard was working. The results began to appear more quickly than any of them had expected. Within 2 weeks, Michael and Matthew could already distinguish between at least 5 different types of vibrations. They created a game where Sarah would produce a sound, and they would try to guess which instrument she was using by touching the correct object. Even more impressive, the boys began to vocalize. They weren't words, but guttural sounds they made when experiencing the most intense vibrations. It was as if they were trying to imitate what they felt. "Sarah, did you see that?" Mrs. Thompson was beaming. "Matthew tried to speak when you hit the xylophone." "I did. And yesterday Michael made a sound like Mama when I showed him the picture of Mrs. Elizabeth." The 3 women knew they were witnessing something historic, but they also knew they couldn't keep it a secret for much longer. Richard was starting to notice changes in his son's behavior. They were happier, more communicative in their homemade sign language, more interested in their surroundings. The moment of discovery arrived unexpectedly on a Thursday afternoon. Richard had cancelled an important meeting because of a headache and decided to come home early. When he entered the living room, he found a scene that made his heart stop. Michael and Matthew were sitting on the floor next to Sarah, their hands stuck to a small speaker that was vibrating intensely. But that wasn't what had shocked Richard. It was the fact that for the first time in 7 years, he heard one of his sons make a sound that remotely resembled a word. "Dad!" Matthew had shouted, not because he could hear his own voice, but because he was feeling a specific vibration that Sarah had associated with their father's arrival. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process what was happening. Sarah quickly stood up, preparing for another scolding, but when she looked at her employer's face, she saw tears streaming down his cheeks. How did they manage? Richard could barely speak. "Mr. Thompson, I can explain everything. They are not cured, but they can perceive sounds through vibrations. With the right help, perhaps they can develop this ability much further." Michael, who had sensed his father's presence, ran to him and did something that hadn't happened in years. He took Richard's hand and pulled him toward the speaker. He wanted to show his father what he had discovered. He wanted to share this new way of experiencing the world with him. Richard knelt on the floor beside his sons and, for the first time since they were born, played with them without feeling that enormous weight in his chest. He saw Michael place his hand on the speaker and smile when he felt the vibration. He saw Matthew try to reproduce the sound the music was making, even though he couldn't hear it in the traditional sense. "Sarah," Richard said after a few minutes of observing his sons, "tell me everything. How did you discover this? How long has this been going on?" Sarah recounted the whole story, from the first time she noticed Michael reacting to the duster to the meeting with Dr. Jennifer Roberts. Richard listened to everything in silence, occasionally asking specific questions, his analytical business mind processing every piece of information. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because you had made it clear that you didn't want any more false hopes, and I knew I needed to be sure I wasn't imagining things before I spoke to you." Richard was silent for a moment, watching Michael try to teach Matthew a new sound he had discovered by tapping 2 wooden spoons together. "You said you spoke with a specialist, Dr. Jennifer Roberts." "Yes, sir. She said specific tests would be needed to assess exactly what kind of auditory perception the boys have, but that there is a possibility of developing this ability of theirs much further." That night, Richard called Elizabeth, who was in Paris. The conversation was tense at first. She thought he was having some kind of emotional outburst, creating hope where there was none. "Richard, we've been through this dozens of times. I can't take another disappointment." "Elizabeth, I saw it with my own eyes. Matthew spoke. Not perfectly, but he spoke, and both of them are reacting to sounds in a way I've never seen before. The doctors said that was impossible. Maybe the doctors were wrong, or maybe they didn't explore all the possibilities." Elizabeth arrived in the United States 2 days later, more skeptical than hopeful. But when she saw her sons demonstrate their new abilities, when she heard Michael try to say "Mommy" through the vibrations he could feel, she broke down in tears. "How is this possible? They They can't hear like we do, explained Sarah, but they can perceive sounds in other ways. And perhaps with the right treatment, they can develop this perception even further. The first appointment with Dr. Jennifer Roberts was scheduled for the following week. Richard and Elizabeth arrived at the clinic with a mix of anxiety and hope they hadn't felt in years. The boys were curious about the new environment, touching the walls and furniture to feel the vibrations of the medical equipment. The exams lasted more than 3 hours. Dr. Jennifer Roberts tested different frequencies, types of vibration, and ways of transmitting sound. Michael and Matthew cooperated like they had never cooperated with doctors before, excited to be doing something they were already familiar with. The results are very promising, the doctor said after analyzing all the tests. They have a specific type of hearing loss that leaves their bone conduction perception intact. With the right devices and specialized therapy, they can develop a limited but functional form of hearing. Does that mean they will be able to hear? Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling. They will be able to perceive sounds, especially human voices and music. It won't be identical to normal hearing, but it will be enough for them to communicate verbally and have a much better quality of life. Richard felt his legs go weak. 7 years of despair and resignation were being replaced by a real, tangible hope. What's the next step? First, we'll make custom bone conduction devices for them. Then we start an intensive speech therapy program. It will be a long process, at least a year, but the results could be life-changing. On the way back home, Michael and Matthew were more excited than usual. It was as if they sensed something important had happened, that their lives were about to change significantly. That night during dinner, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He talked to his sons. Not just through gestures, but by speaking out loud, knowing they could perceive the vibrations of his voice through the wooden table. "Daddy is going to help you hear better," he said, placing the boys' hands on his throat so they could feel the vibrations as he spoke. Michael and Matthew smiled and tried to imitate the movements they felt, producing sounds that for the first time seemed intentional. Elizabeth, who had spent years avoiding intimate moments with her sons to avoid the pain, came closer and did the same thing. When Matthew tried to repeat the sound she made while saying, "Mommy," she couldn't hold back her tears. "Sarah," Richard called to the housekeeper who was clearing the table, "how can I ever thank you for this?" "You don't need to thank me, Dr. Thompson. Seeing them this happy is the best payment I could ever receive." But Richard had already made a decision. The next day, he sought out Sarah in private. "I want you to become my son's official therapist. I will pay for you to take a specialization course in hearing impairment and speech therapy. You will work alongside Dr. Jennifer throughout their entire treatment." "Doctor, I don't know if I'm capable of this." "Sarah, you managed to see what dozens of specialists missed. You have something that can't be learned in college, intuition and genuine love for children. With the proper technical knowledge, you will be the best therapist they could ever have." The following months brought complete transformation to the entire family's life. Michael and Matthew received their first bone conduction devices and began intensive therapy. The progress was slow but steady. The first complete word Michael managed to say was water. Not because he could hear the sound perfectly, but because he had learned to associate the specific vibrations of that word with the object he wanted. Matthew soon followed with "thank you," a word he made sure to use whenever someone gave him something. Sarah divided her time between the specialization course and the therapy sessions with the boys. She discovered she had a natural talent for understanding each one's specific needs and developing personalized exercises. Elizabeth changed completely. She cancelled all scheduled trips and began actively participating in her children's routine. She learned formal sign language to complement the communication they were developing and became a fierce advocate for the rights of children with hearing impairments. Richard transformed part of his company into a foundation dedicated to hearing impairment research. He hired Dr. Jennifer to lead a center of excellence that offered free treatment to low-income families. Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Williams became official therapy assistants, each specializing in different aspects of the boys' development. The entire house had transformed into a stimulating environment, full of music, vibrations, and for the first time in 7 years, children's voices trying to form words. The most emotional moment came 9 months after the treatment began. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the whole family was gathered in the living room listening to classical music at a volume the boys could perceive through their devices and environmental vibrations. Suddenly, Michael stopped playing, looked directly at Richard and said clearly, "Dad, I love you." They weren't the most perfect words in the world, but they were the most beautiful Richard had ever heard. Matthew, not wanting to be left behind, looked at Elizabeth and managed to say, "Pretty mommy." At that moment, everyone in the room cried. Sarah, Mrs. Thompson, Mrs. Williams, Richard, Elizabeth, and even Michael and Matthew, who understood through vibrations and the adult's body language that they had achieved something very special. Dr. Jennifer, who had been closely monitoring the boys' progress, confirmed they had exceeded all initial expectations. With the devices and continued therapy, they could lead practically normal lives, attend regular schools, and communicate effectively with others. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. 2 years after this journey began, Michael and Matthew were enrolled in a private school that had been adapted to welcome students with different types of disabilities. They had friends, participated in extracurricular activities, and most importantly, they were happy. Sarah had graduated as a speech therapist specialized in hearing impairment and became a reference in the field. She continued working with Michael and Matthew, but also helped other families through the foundation Richard had created. The story of the Thompson family became well known in medical circles as a success story that demonstrated the importance of never giving up and always seeking alternative approaches. Several other specialists sought out Richard and Elizabeth to better understand the methods that had been used. On a Saturday afternoon, while watching their children playing in the yard with friends from school, Richard reflected on everything that had happened. If it hadn't been for the persistence and intuition of a housekeeper who refused to accept that there was no solution, their children would still be trapped in silence. Elizabeth approached and held his hand. "Did you ever imagine we would get this far?" "Never. For years I thought we were a family marked by tragedy, that our children would never have a full life. Sarah showed us we were wrong." Not just Sarah, Mrs. Thompson, Mrs. Williams, we all learned that love and persistence can overcome any obstacle. At that moment, Matthew ran up to them and with his voice still imperfect but full of joy said, "Dad, Mom, do you want to play with us?" It was a simple question, one any 9-year-old would ask their parents. But for Richard and Elizabeth, it was confirmation that their children had truly found their place in the world. "Of course we do," replied Elizabeth, getting up from her chair. "What do you want to play?" asked Richard. "Music!" shouted Michael and Matthew at the same time, running toward the house where the therapy instruments had turned into favorite toys. Sarah, who was watching the scene from the kitchen window, smiled. She remembered the first day she had arrived at that house 3 years ago and found 2 children playing silently in the yard. Now, the same yard was full of laughter, voices, and music. Mrs. Thompson approached her. "Sarah, my dear, you changed everyone's life in this house." "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, they changed my life too. They taught me that no matter how impossible a situation may seem, there is always a way to find hope." "And now, what are your plans?" "To keep working with them, of course, but I also want to help other families going through what the Thompsons went through. The foundation has already received over 50 similar cases. Every child is unique. Every case has its specific challenges. But now we know it's possible." That evening, during dinner, Richard made a special announcement. "Kids, you know that Sarah changed our lives in a very special way. That's why I want to do something important." Michael and Matthew paid attention, curious. "From today on, Sarah is no longer our employee. She is part of our family. And to celebrate that, we are changing the name of the foundation to the Michael and Matthew Thompson Institute for Auditory Development. And also," added Elizabeth, "we want you to know that everything we achieved was possible because we never gave up on each other. Family means sticking together through hard times and celebrating victories together." Michael, who had developed an impressive vocabulary in recent months, raised his juice glass and said, "Then let's make a toast. To our family! To our family! Everyone repeated, including Mrs. Thompson, Mrs. Williams, and Sarah. The months that followed brought even more progress. Michael discovered he had a talent for music and began learning piano, using a combination of residual hearing and tactile perception. Matthew showed more interest in sports and joined the school soccer team, where his hearing impairment did not prevent him from being an excellent player. The foundation grew quickly. Richard hired a multidisciplinary team that included speech therapists, psychologists, social workers, and occupational therapists. In 2 years, more than 300 families had benefited from the free programs. Sarah became a nationally recognized speaker, sharing Michael and Matthew's story at medical conferences and inclusion events. Her message was always the same: never accept that there's no solution without exploring every possibility. At one of these talks, she met Dr. David Miller, a researcher developing even more advanced technologies for hearing impairment. They began a collaboration that resulted in more efficient devices and innovative therapeutic methods. Elizabeth became deeply involved with organizations for parents of children with hearing disabilities. Her personal experience and financial resources made her a powerful voice in the fight for more inclusive public policies. The school where Michael and Matthew studied became a model for inclusive education, receiving visits from educators across the country. The boys took pride in showing visitors how they could participate in all activities alongside their classmates. At home, life had completely returned to normal. Meals were filled with lively conversations, with Michael talking about his music lessons and Matthew describing his soccer games. Richard and Elizabeth actively participated in their children's lives, making up for lost years with genuine interest in every detail. Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Williams had become informal experts on hearing impairment, helping other families who sought out the foundation. Their practical experiences complemented the technical knowledge of professionals. One special afternoon, 5 years after Sarah's initial discovery, the whole family gathered in the living room. Michael was playing piano, while Matthew sang a song they'd learned at school. Richard and Elizabeth accompanied them, clapping to the rhythm. "Remember when we thought they'd never be able to hear music?" Elizabeth commented. "I remember," Richard replied. "Actually, they taught us that there are many ways to hear and experience the world." Sarah, who was watching the scene, reflected on all the moments they'd shared together. From the first timid experiments with the toy drum to this moment of family celebration, every step had been a victory achieved through persistence and love. "Aunt Sarah," Michael called to her, "are you going to teach other children like you taught us?" "Of course I will, Michael. There are many families who need to discover that the impossible is sometimes just a matter of finding the right path." "And will we help too?" asked Matthew. "You're already helping. Every time you show others that children with hearing disabilities can have normal, happy lives, you're changing the world." That evening, after the children went to sleep, Richard, Elizabeth, and Sarah talked on the porch about the Foundation's future plans. They wanted to expand services to other regions of the country and develop training programs for specialized professionals. "Sarah," said Richard, "sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't insisted on those early experiments, if you'd given up when I told you to stop." "I could never have given up, Dr. Richard. When I saw Michael's reaction to that first sound, I knew I had to keep trying. The children gave me the strength to persist. And now they're giving strength to hundreds of other families," Elizabeth added. Time passed and Michael and Matthew grew into confident, sociable teenagers. Michael developed his passion for music to the point where he began composing his own songs, creating melodies that could be appreciated both through traditional hearing and vibrational perception. Matthew excelled at sports and became captain of the school's soccer team. His natural leadership and communication skills inspired his colleagues, who often completely forgot about his hearing impairment. At 15, the two brothers decided they wanted to participate more actively in the foundation that bore their names. They began visiting other families, sharing their experiences, and showing that it was possible to overcome the challenges of hearing loss. During one of these visits, they met Olivia, an 8-year-old girl who had been born with the same type of hearing loss as them. Her parents were desperate, just as Richard and Elizabeth had been years before. "Olivia," said Michael, communicating through a combination of speech and signs. "I know how you feel. I was born this way too." The girl looked at him curiously. She knew Michael was different from the adults who always tried to help her, but she couldn't quite understand why. Matthew showed her the devices he used and explained how they worked. He picked up a small xylophone and demonstrated how she could feel the music through vibrations. "Would you like to try?" he offered. Olivia hesitated for a moment, then placed her hands on the instrument. When Matthew began to play, her face lit up with the same expression of discovery that Michael and Matthew had had years before. Olivia's parents cried when they saw their daughter reacting positively for the first time since they had discovered her disability. Michael and Matthew spent the entire afternoon playing with her, teaching games they had learned during their own therapy. "Can they really hear?" Olivia's mother asked Elizabeth. "Yes, they can. Not exactly like we do, but they can communicate perfectly. They study in a regular school, have friends, hobbies, dreams. It took a few years, but today they have a completely normal life." That visit marked the beginning of a special program at the foundation. Teenagers and young adults who had overcome hearing disabilities became mentors for younger children and their families. The emotional impact of seeing someone who had gone through the same challenge was incomparable. During high school, Michael and Matthew became popular speakers at schools, talking about inclusion and overcoming obstacles. Their presentations were always moving, combining music, practical demonstrations, and personal testimonies. Sarah, who had become one of the most respected speech therapists in the country, often accompanied them to these talks. Seeing the boys she had helped discover the world of sounds become advocates for other children with disabilities was her greatest professional achievement. At 17, Michael decided he wanted to study music therapy at university, specializing in working with people with hearing loss. Matthew chose adapted physical education, wanting to use sports as a tool for inclusion. Richard and Elizabeth fully supported their son's choices. The family had learned that each person has their own way of contributing to the world, and they wanted to give the boys complete freedom to find theirs. At the high school graduation party, Michael and Matthew were invited to give a speech representing the entire class. They went up on stage together, confident and articulate. "My classmates, teachers, and families," Michael began, "Matthew and I want to talk about overcoming, not because we are special or different, but because we have learned that all of us face challenges in life. When we were born," Matthew continued, "the doctors told our parents we would never be able to hear, that our lives would be limited by silence. But our family did not accept that sentence. A housekeeper named Sarah, who is now our second mother and one of the most important speech therapists in the United States, refused to believe there was no solution," said Michael. "She taught us that there are many ways to hear the world. And our entire family taught us that love and persistence can overcome any obstacle," Matthew concluded. The audience was silent, moved by the two young men's words. "That's why we want to leave a message for all of you," Michael continued. "Never accept that something is impossible without exploring every possibility, and never give up on the people you love, no matter how difficult the situation may seem. Our parents could have placed us in an institution and moved on with their lives. Our family could have given up after so many discouraging doctors," Matthew said. "But they chose to fight for us, and today we're here, ready to fight for others." The auditorium erupted in applause. Richard, Elizabeth, and Sarah, who were in the audience, cried with pride. Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Williams, who had become honorary grandmothers to the boys, couldn't contain their emotion. After graduation, Michael and Matthew spent a year working full-time at the foundation before starting college. They wanted to better prepare for their future careers by learning hands-on how to help other families. During this period, the foundation launched a pioneering program, a special school that combined regular education with specialized therapies for children with hearing disabilities. Michael helped develop the music therapy program, while Matthew created adapted sports activities. The school became an international model, receiving visits from educators and researchers from various countries. Michael and Matthew took pride in showing visitors how children with hearing disabilities could learn and develop fully when given proper support. Sarah was promoted to technical director of the foundation, coordinating all therapeutic programs. Her journey from housekeeper to renowned specialist became an inspiration for many others who worked in positions considered simple but had potential for much more. Elizabeth became involved with international disability rights organizations, using her experience as a mother to influence public policy. Richard expanded investments in research, funding studies on new assistive technologies. One special evening, 10 years after the initial discovery, the entire extended family gathered at the mansion for a celebratory dinner. Besides Richard, Elizabeth, Michael, Matthew, and Sarah, Mrs. Thompson, Mrs. Williams, Dr. Jennifer Roberts, Dr. David Miller, and several other people who had been important on the journey were present. "I'd like to make a toast," Richard said, raising his glass. 10 years ago, our family lived in darkness, not just because of the silence surrounding our sons, but because of the disbelief that we could have a full life. "Sarah," he continued, looking directly at her, "you didn't just restore sounds to our children. You restored hope to our family and to hundreds of other families we serve through the foundation." "But I didn't do it alone," Sarah replied. "Every person at this table contributed in some way. Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Williams with their affection and dedication, Dr. Jennifer with her technical knowledge, Dr. David with his technological innovations, and especially Michael and Matthew, who never gave up trying." Michael, now a confident and articulate 19-year-old, asked to speak. "I want to thank all of you, not just for helping us here, but for teaching us that our limitations don't define who we are. For showing us that we can use our experiences to help other people." Matthew, always more direct, added, "And I want to say that we're proof that the impossible is just a word. When we were born, we were two deaf children in a desperate family. Today, we are two young men preparing for our careers. We have friends, hobbies, and most importantly, a family that never gave up on us." Mrs. Thompson, now over 70, but still full of energy, wiped tears from her eyes. "I've cared for many children in my life, but Michael and Matthew taught me that caring isn't just about meeting basic needs. It's about believing in each person's potential and fighting to make that potential come true." Mrs. Williams, moved, added, "When I started working in this house, it was silent as a tomb. Today, it's always full of music, laughter, and conversation. That taught me that a home isn't defined by its walls, but by the love inside it." Dr. Jennifer Roberts, who had become a close family friend, reflected on the importance of that case in her career. "Michael and Matthew taught me that medicine can't be limited to traditional protocols. Sometimes the most innovative solutions come from careful observation and the willingness to try unconventional approaches." Dr. David Miller, who had developed several technologies inspired by the twins' case, agreed. "Biomedical engineering advances when we have real cases that challenge us to think outside the box. Working with Michael and Matthew, we developed devices that now benefit children worldwide." Elizabeth, who had transformed from an absent mother into an active advocate for disability rights, shared her own reflection. "I spent years running from my children's reality because I couldn't bear the pain of seeing them limited. Sarah taught me that true courage isn't avoiding pain. It's facing it head-on and turning it into strength to fight." The evening continued with music, stories, and much laughter. Michael played piano while Matthew sang, and everyone joined in a celebration that symbolized not just one family's triumph, but the victory of human perseverance over adversity. Months later, Michael and Matthew enrolled in their respective universities. Michael was accepted into the music therapy program at Columbia University, while Matthew chose adaptive physical education at New York University. During their college years, they remained involved with the foundation, now as student consultants. Their unique perspectives as young men who had overcome hearing disabilities were valuable for developing new programs. Michael specialized in using music as therapy for children with various types of disabilities, not just hearing. He developed methods combining vibrational, visual, and tactile perception to make music accessible to everyone. Matthew focused on inclusive sports, creating programs that allowed children with and without disabilities to compete together in balanced and fun ways. His methods were adopted by several schools throughout New York State. During college, both met their future wives. Michael fell in love with Emily, a psychology student who also had hearing disabilities. Matthew married Jessica, a special education teacher who shared his passion for inclusion through sports. Both weddings were celebrated at the family mansion, with parties that included music adapted for guests with hearing disabilities and activities allowing people with different abilities to participate fully. Richard and Elizabeth became devoted grandparents when Michael and Emily had a daughter, Olivia, named after the first child the brothers had mentored, and Matthew and Jessica had twins, Ethan and Benjamin. The children grew up in a family where hearing disabilities were treated naturally, without drama or overprotection. Olivia was born with normal hearing, but learned sign language as a second language and grew up playing instruments that produced intense vibrations, so grandfather Michael could hear her play. Ethan and Benjamin were born with normal hearing as well, but from a young age they participated in the Foundation's activities, learning about inclusion and diversity as a natural part of their lives. Sarah Johnson became the honorary grandmother to all the children, maintaining her special role as the person who had transformed that entire family's destiny. At 50, she remained professionally active, but also dedicated time to writing a book about her experience. The book, titled The Sound of Silence: How a Housekeeper Changed a Family's Destiny, became a national bestseller and was translated into several languages. Sarah used the proceeds from the royalties to further expand the Foundation's programs. Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Williams, now retired, continued living in the mansion as family members. Their experiences became valuable for training new caregivers who worked with children with disabilities. The Michael and Matthew Thompson Institute grew and became an international reference in hearing impairment. It served over 2,000 cases a year and had trained professionals who took the developed methods to other states and countries. In recognition of her pioneering work, Sarah received several honors, including an honorable mention from the Department of Health and an international award for innovation in speech therapy. Richard Thompson transformed a large part of his fortune into social investments, becoming one of the United States' leading philanthropists in the field of disability. Elizabeth became an advisor to international human rights organizations. One Sunday afternoon, 20 years after the initial discovery, the whole family was gathered in the mansion's garden. Michael, now a recognized music therapist, was teaching his daughter Olivia to play the piano. Matthew, director of a state inclusive sports program, was playing with his twin sons. Richard and Elizabeth, now with graying hair but still vigorous, watched the scene with deep satisfaction. Sarah, who remained a constant presence in their lives, was beside them. "Sarah," said Elizabeth, "did you ever imagine on that first day when you saw Michael react to the duster that we would get this far?" "I never imagined it would go so far," replied Sarah. "I just knew those boys had something special and that it was worth trying." The rest was a collective effort by this whole wonderful family. The most impressive thing, reflected Richard, is how a simple decision not to give up transformed not just our lives, but the lives of thousands of others through the Foundation. Michael, who had stopped playing the piano to join the adults' conversation, added, "And the most important thing is that we proved family isn't just who you're born with. It's who chooses to stay together and fight together for the same things." Matthew, always practical, concluded, "And we proved that impossible is just a word we use when we haven't found the right path yet." Olivia, the 10-year-old granddaughter, looked at the adults and asked with the typical curiosity of children, "Grandpa Michael, what was it like when you couldn't hear?" Michael smiled and knelt down to her level. "It was different, Olivia. But you know what we discovered? That there are many ways to hear, with our ears, with our hands, with our heart. The important thing is to never stop trying to understand the world around us. And never give up on the people we love," added Matthew, picking up his sons. That afternoon ended like many others, with music, laughter, and stories. But this time, there was something special in the air. It was the awareness that they had built something bigger than a family. They had built a legacy of hope, persistence, and love that would continue impacting lives for generations. As the sun began to set, Richard made one last toast. "To our family, who taught me that miracles happen when we combine love, persistence, and the courage to never accept that something is impossible." "To our family," everyone repeated in unison, including the young children who, even without fully understanding the meaning of the words, knew they were part of something very special. That night, after the children went to sleep and the adults retired, Sarah stayed alone in the garden for a few minutes. She remembered the day she had first arrived at that house 2 decades ago and found 2 children playing in silence. Now, the same garden had witnessed first words, first musical steps, graduations, weddings, births. It had become the setting for a story of transformation that began with a simple observation and grew through the determination of a family that refused to accept limitations. Looking at the lit windows of the house, where she knew the children representing the 3rd generation of this journey were sleeping, Sarah smiled. The story of Michael and Matthew had become much more than overcoming a disability. It had become proof that when we combine love, science, and persistence, we can transform not only individual lives but the world around us. End of story. And you, dear listener, what did you think of this moving story? Can you imagine the strength Sarah had to not give up when everyone thought it was impossible? Tell us in the comments. Do you believe love and persistence can truly overcome any obstacle? Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel to follow more heartwarming stories.